Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Oral Talmud. I'm Dan Levinson. I'm here with B'nai Lepi. Hey, B'nai.
Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, another week has gone by. Viewers will notice that I finally cut my hair for the end of the pandemic, sort of on Lag BaOmer. So you could track my COVID experience through hair length. Um,
You,
anyways,
you look very sharp.
thank you. Um, Well, and I'm back to my Svara t-shirt, but you're not today. So,
Not today. Still behind on the laundry.
and we have a new student in the class.
Yes, it's Louie.
Hey, Louie.
Louie the dog.
All right, so let's jump into it.
Okay, great.
So today we are going to look at a text that is, along the lines of the text that we studied last week, and that we're looking at this question of, I guess just to remind folks that it's really this question of, to what extent do the rabbis of the Talmud imagine that they have the power, that we have the power to take ownership of the tradition, right? I mean, is that how you would frame it?
Yeah, exactly. And as we've been thinking more and more about myth and the way that lots and lots of stories support that myth, stories and texts and conversations that become part of the tradition. This feels like one of those supporting debates
Mm-hmm.
that supports that idea of rabbinic authority, and by extension, authority of people
Mm-hmm.
who are deemed to have the qualifications, right? Not ordination, but some amount of learning and some svaradicness to do what they will to the tradition to make it better.
Okay, so let's just jump in and take a look at this text. So we are in the tractate of Kiddushin, page 32a, and this particular part starts this way. Rav Yitzchak Bar Shila says that Rav Matana says that Rav Chisda says. By the way, is there any importance, do you think, to the number of sources cited for any given? Sometimes it's just one or two. This one said that this one says, but sometimes you get a whole long string.
I don't know. I don't know if that means anything. It's a good question because it's not as typical to have a whole string, although it's not unusual either.
Right.
And I wonder if, now that you're raising the question, does a quote in the name of a single rabbi mean that rabbi or that sage originated the idea? And if he didn't, that's really interesting. It's particularly interesting at this moment for me, what you're bringing up, because, I give this crash talk, this talk of my theory, and more I'm realizing that some of the stories that I tell in the context of that talk, I'm no longer sure if they're my stories, if they're my teacher's stories, if they're my teacher's teacher stories. And I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about how it makes a lot of sense if you say, well, so and so would bring this up, but he was citing the original source. That's typical. When you cite a chain of sources, whether it's in this case 3 or sometimes I think it's 4. I don't even know what the longest one. I think Lex might know. Lex Rofberg might know. I feel like he said something once, but 4 or 5 was the longest ever. What? But like, what is it that you're saying there? Is it something as simple as, well, this was a quote sort of said quite often. This is significant because there were key people in multiple generations that really had this as their catchphrase, but we should cite the original source, and it does go back to, in this case, Rav Chisda, but really this was a biggie because people kept saying it, and it wasn't or is it something else? It's like PhD dissertation someone should write.
Yeah, I love that question. I never thought about it. And by the way, we should probably note that the context of this passage we're learning today in the Tractate of Kiddushin is on the question of what does it mean? The rabbis are asking, what does that piece of Torah mean where it says you should honor thy mother and thy father? What does it mean to honor and fear? There are two separate commandments. So this is in a big examination of what do we owe our parents, and how exactly do we honor them? Okay.
Okay, so Rav Yitzchak Bar Shila says that, Rav Matana says that, Rav Chisda says, with regard to a father who forgoes his honor is forgone. So we're talking about here that, there's one of the 10 commandments that you have to honor your father and mother, but if a father says in some fashion, you don't have to honor me, or more likely something that is known to be a way in which a son is to honor a father, I don't know if there's a specific example of what that is in your mind, but if the father says, you don't have to do that thing for me, then the son doesn't have to, and he hasn't violated the commandment, right?
That's right. We should unpack this because this is big and I think vexing. And I apologize. There is a tree being cut down just outside my window, so I apologize.
You don't hear it too much.
Okay, great. So first of all, some examples of what it looks like to honor. So the previous page fleshes that out. Some of the ways that a child is obligated to honor a parent is to not sit in the parent's designated place, whether that be at the dinner table, in the synagogue, or in some other social gathering. That's one way. Another way is to not contradict the parent when the parent is in some sort of dispute with somebody else, right? Not to take the side of the other person. That was a big one when I was a child. I think my father didn't realize how much Talmud was behind him when he used to say, don't contradict your father.
I was thinking my kids are, 0 for 2 so far, but keep going.
Another one is to escort your parent in and out, which, I'm not sure exactly what that means, like to take their arm. I'm thinking of my mom who's elderly, and there are some steps going up to her house, and I help her up the step. Maybe it's that. And to make sure your parent has clothing and is cared for. Interestingly, you don't have to do it yourself. Rambam specifically says, if your parents are driving you nuts and you cannot tolerate to be around them, you don't have to, but you have to make sure that somebody else takes care of them the way that you should have, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so these are some of the concrete ways that you're obligated to honor your parent. And what I think is really vexing about this sentence, and I don't see it addressed anywhere, is why would a parent have the ability to release a child from that obligation to honor them when it's God that's commanding it? You know what I mean? God commanded you to honor your parent. Why would the parent have the right to interfere, like to intervene in that actual relationship between you and God, to say, oh, that's okay, you don't have to do that? Like, I'm picturing God going, whoa, who said you could do that? That was my order, and only I get, right? I think it's funny. And honoring your mother and father, it's one of the big 10.
Uh-huh.
So it's just funny. Why would it? And by the way, it's not necessarily only by the parents' words. It doesn't say how, let's say in this case, it specifies father, but I think it means either parent. If a father wants to be mochel, wants to release the child, does it have to be in words? Could it be in actions? Could the father do something which would be tantamount to releasing that child? I hope it's not too distracting to tell you a story of why I think this could be the case. Back in my first year of rabbinical school, We all had to write theses, dissertations, because they sort of throw a master's degree at you after a year or two and you write a big paper. And I was well into my thesis on a completely different topic when my advisor, Danny Gordis, called me into his office and he said, B'nai, I want you to change your topic completely. In the last 24 hours, I've had 3 inquiries on a question by people. I have a letter here. I got 2 phone calls. I don't know the answer. I want you to answer the question. And the question was, if a parent has sexually abused the child, does that child still have the obligation to say Kaddish for that parent when that parent dies? And so I changed my topic to that and I tried to answer that question. And one of the sub-questions I needed to answer was, can a parent do anything which would effectively release the child from the obligation to honor that parent? And if so, is abuse one of those things which, though it's not in words, I release you, you don't have to honor me, is an action which effectively releases the child? So it doesn't have to necessarily be words. I'll leave the question of my thesis aside and how I answered it, but that's the question here. Can a parent do something that releases the child? And seems like Rav Chisda says, yeah, the parent can say, you don't have to honor me.
By the way, that's a very amazing story, and also, note for professors out there how to get, free research assistance from
Yes,
from your top students.
Yeah. I've also I've done a lot of thinking about this, and I think one possibility for why you would want a parent to release a child is that according to Jewish law, if a child strikes a parent, that's a capital offense. Okay. So if a parent knows that a child is about to do something like that, the parent actually has the ability to release them from the consequence of the action that kid is about to take by saying, you're no longer obligated to honor me. Therefore, whatever you do, you're sort of exculpated. I don't know if that's part of what's going on. I just think it's a really interesting thing. And I'm always surprised that it's not interrogated more.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm also thinking about the other. Sometimes we're told about the 10 Commandments that the first 5 are between human beings and God, and the second 5 are between human beings and other human beings. But the honor your father and mother is the 5th commandment, I think. So it's in the category of the ones that are between people and God. So all the more so. Even in the ones that are between people and people, like thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder. Well, you can't really just tell somebody it's okay to murder me, so right. So even in those, all the more so the ones between people and God. So that's very interesting.
Yeah. So we'll have to leave a sticky on there.
Okay. So in any event, though, this case is looking at or is saying that the father can sort of forego this honor. And Rav Yosef says, even with regard to a rabbi who forgoes his honor is foregone, as it is stated, and the Lord went before them by day in Exodus 13:21. We didn't have the rest. I didn't put the rest of that.
I think I may have interrupted you. Did we get out onto the table the idea that Rav Chisda said, even though a father can forego the honor due to him, a Rav, a teacher, cannot do so? Did we get that out?
No, we didn't. So, okay. Sorry. I skipped to read that. Okay. So yeah. So let me start again. So Rav Yitzchak Bar Shila says that Rav Matana says that Rav Chisda says, with regard to a father who forgoes his honor is foregone. But a rabbi who forgoes his honor is not foregone. Right.
And so the first thing that I think is funny is that it's like, where does it say that you have to honor a Rav anyway? That's not at all obvious.
And a father is in the 10 Commandments.
Exactly. So first we have to have assume that you're obligated to honor a Rav, to even ask the question, well, what if that Rav says you don't have to honor me anymore? And it's a little bit of an obscure reference, but there's a line in Leviticus that says you should rise, before the, do we have that verse?
We have that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You shall rise before the age and show deference to the old, which, on its face has nothing to do with a teacher, but the rabbis seem to want to root this obligation to honor a teacher in the Torah. Interestingly, it could be a move to make this obligation Torah-idic, which makes the undoing of it all the more dramatic. But we'll circle around to that at the end. So, okay, someone who is old and whatever, that's the verse that roots the obligation to honor a Rav. Okay, and Rav Chisda is saying, if your teacher says to you, you don't have to honor me, those words will mean nothing. That doesn't effectively end the student's obligation to honor their teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And by the way, is there a list of things given for that, like sitting in their place or, holding them when they go?
You know what? I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
I ought to look that up.
Yeah, because you would be able to get a lot of goodies if it turns out that there's a list.
Yeah, the idea is called l'sharet et harav, to serve one's master, to serve one's teacher. I'm sure there must be an enumeration somewhere. I should definitely look that up.
In Svara, do you get? Is there? No.
I don't get a lot of special treatment, but I do get a lot of kavod. I do get a lot. And by the way, this whole thing of pitting parent against teacher, not directly against each other, but comparing what you owe to one and the other, and your relationship to your parent versus your relationship to your teacher, is a theme all throughout the Talmud. And there are lots of stories and anecdotes about, if you're drowning, you and your parent and your teacher, all three of you are in a boat, and the boat saying, who do you save first? And if you can only save one, who do you save? It's really interesting. I suppose I should.
Is it the teacher?
It is the teacher.
Huh.
Yeah, you let your parent drown and
Wow.
you save your teacher. And they ask, why would that be? And the answer is, your parent gave you this world by birthing you and raising you, but your teacher gives you the world to come by teaching you Torah. And that, Anyway, so parent-teacher, there's a really interesting sort of cultural shift in, where we should be facing, that the rabbis are trying to make between the familial unit and the learning unit, student to teacher.
By the way, it strikes me that if I recall correctly, I forget if it's Jesus or Paul that writes this in the New Testament, but I think that there's something along those lines in the New Testament as well, that Jesus, I think, says, you might have to leave your family to come follow me, something along those lines. And that, I think, strikes Jews as some kind of, breaking with Judaism. That's what, as opposed to actually a consistent with the philosophy of the rabbis or of this period. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
By the way, I should note that we're going to do a session at our Judaism Unbound Jewish Live Shavuot study session, and which anyone watching can join us. It's from Saturday, May 15th at 6 p.m. Eastern, all the way through 30 hours later at 11:59 on Sunday night, the 16th. And you and I are doing a session at I think 7, and also another session at 10 Eastern that is with Gary Stevens, who does a podcast called History in the Bible. But this season, he's looking at this divergence between Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. So, maybe a question like this could come up, to what extent are some of these things just kind of in the air and in the water of late Second Temple Judaism and early Rabbinic Judaism, early Christianity, and which of these things actually represent sort of innovations of Rabbinic Judaism or Christianity.
Yeah, I can't wait to hang out with you and Gary.
That'll be fun.
I'm still chuckling to myself that he thinks I'm jolly.
Yeah, he wrote an email that he said you were the jolliest person on the internet.
Which makes me think jolly must mean something different in Australia.
That's what I was also thinking. I was wondering.
Anyway,
not that you're not jolly, but
I know, I love that. Gosh, it could like completely change my story about myself.
right.
But getting back, wait, I realize I sold the rabbis a little bit short and left the poor parent drowning a little bit unnecessarily, because the end of the text that I mentioned where it says you should save your teacher actually goes on to say, but what if your parent is your teacher?
Uh-huh.
In which case you save your parent. And I think the ... for me at the end of that is, what parent isn't their child's teacher?
Uh-huh.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So parents, don't worry if you are drowning.
Feels like a lot of pressure to make under a decision in a drowning situation. Hopefully it's more like a thought experiment. Okay.
Yeah.
So Rav Chisda says that a father can forgo his honor, but a rabbi cannot.
Mhm.
And then Rav Yosef comes along and says, no, even with regard to a rabbi, he can forgo his honor. It can be the same. It can be that situation where he says, you don't have to honor me. And
That's
he's
right.
using as a proof text from Exodus, this verse, Exodus 13:21, and the Lord went before them by day. How does that connect to that? I don't.
Yeah. Okay. So this has always been slippery for me. And the last time I taught this text, one of the students in the Beit Midrash came up with what felt like, yes, that's the answer. And I've lost it again. But okay. So here's what I think I have. This verse is describing the time in the desert between Sinai and entering Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
And the image is that God led the people through the desert. And I think the assumption here is that that's kind of a lowly activity for God. I always picture the tour guides, I remember when I was a kid, my parents took us all to Europe. Instead of throwing me a big bat mitzvah party, they said, which do you want? You want a big party or a trip to Europe? I took the trip to Europe and Israel. And I remember the tour guides, for some reason, it really impressed me, who are always like, walking backwards. We're walking, with the flags. And I'm like, it's a little silly to imagine God doing that. Here's God. We're walking, God with the flags. That's kind of demeaning for God. I mean, maybe for a tour guide it makes, but God's like doing, I think that's the message, that if God is willing to lower God's self so much as to be the tour guide, come on, then surely a teacher can lower themselves and forego their honor. So this image of God leading human beings, sort of coming down from on high down to earth, is tantamount to God releasing the honor that we owe God, sort of demeaning or lowering God's self. And this is a kal vachomer. If God can release God's honor by coming down in such a lowly way, certainly a Rav can. I think that's what do you think?
No, that sounds right. That I think that's how I understand it, basically. Although, the case, it's a little bit of a weird case, and like it makes me wonder, like, first of all, is there a better case? Like, is there some other case where...
There's always a better case. There's always a better proof, which is, I think, part of what the rabbis are doing. They're always demonstrating their distance. The rabbis are always demonstrating, and this is, something that David Kramer articulates really clearly. They're always demonstrating not the extent to which they need the Torah to support what they're saying, but the degree to which they don't need the Torah, and the forced proofs are there to show those who can see what they're doing and tolerate it, the Hamevin Yavins, that clearly they're not using this text for the support. They're using it to say, I I clearly don't need support, because if I did, I'd find better support. But if you need something for you to feel better, here, have this verse.
Yeah, because like if I just like scanning my mind, I'm thinking like, oh, there was the case in Sodom and Gomorrah where Abraham negotiates with God, and in a sense, God is lowering his honor by saying like, I'm willing to even engage in a negotiation with this guy, and there are cases where Moses, yells at God for wanting to kill the people and whatever, and that seems much more of a clear-cut case of God, and God agrees with Moses. He says, I'll forgive them as you asked, and it's a great case of God lowering God's self to to give in to a man, and this one, I mean, this one feels like, so wait, you're saying he lowered himself because he led his people through the wilderness to his promised land? I mean, that's kind of like what he was doing. Like, he was the leader. Like, he wasn't, God wasn't trying to lower God's self. God was actually raising God's self by taking this leadership position. So yeah, so I think it's kind of what you say. Either it's like, oh, this is a bad, or yeah, it's intentionally a bad example.
Yeah,
it's really interesting.
Okay, so that's Rav Yosef's proof for why it is that it's okay for a Rav to forego the Rav's honor.
Right. Okay. And then Rava comes in, and
our hero Rava.
Right. And says, but this was kind of what I was thinking. How can these cases be compared? There, with regard to the story of God lowering God's self by leading the people, with regard to the Holy Blessed One, the world is his and the Torah is his, and therefore he can forgo his honor. So, I mean, that's what I was saying. Like, if I'm like Joe Biden, and Joe Biden, comes to a kindergarten and he lets the kids, sit on his lap, he's the president of the United States. Like, he can, he wants to have some fun with the kids. I mean, like, he can do that. That doesn't mean that anybody can now go around saying, oh, if you, shoot the president with a water gun, don't worry about it. He already gave up his honor to the kids, and so now we can treat him any way we want, or we can treat his staff any way we want. Like, that's not a good example.
Exactly. And Rava's successful in his challenge to this proof text. You can't have I always forget if it's major to minor or minor to major, but in Jewish terms, you can't have a kal if there's no chomer. In other words, you have to have the surprising, unlikely case fall in the surprising way to get the less surprising, to be able to deduce the less surprising case. And this isn't a surprising case. God being able to give up that's not surprising, just as Rava says, because the whole world belongs to God and the Torah is inside the world. So God owns the Torah, and the assumption is that the honor due to a Rav isn't to the Rav themselves, it's to the Torah that the Rav teaches. Mm-hmm. That's what you're honoring. You're honoring that person's Torah. Mm. So God owns the Torah, so that's why God can forego it. Mm-hmm. That isn't surprising. Therefore, we can't deduce anything less surprising from it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of like another, are there other kind of examples? I mean, I was thinking like, you can decorate your house, the outside of your house in whatever crazy way you want. But if some kids come and do that, it's vandalism. Just because you did it to yourself doesn't mean that you've now opened the door for everybody to do it. And there's some version of that, because like you say, the rabbi here is playing like an intermediate role, so it's not quite a great example, but it's in that realm.
Yeah, I think that's a good example.
Okay, so then it goes on. By contrast, and this is still Rava speaking as you read it. Yeah. So by contrast, here it is his Torah. Is it his Torah that the teacher can forego his honor? So so Rava is saying no. So in the initial thrust or parry or whatever is the Torah belongs to God. it doesn't belong to the rabbi. The rabbi is just kind of an agent of God. And so just the fact that God lowered God's self in one case doesn't mean that the rabbi can now take liberty to lower the rabbi self, which is functionally lowering God's self by, lowering God, but because the Torah belongs to God, right? That's so it doesn't follow from that, as you
Right.
said.
So this is the last piece of Rava's challenge. It's the
Mhm.
rhetorical question. Wait a minute. God can forego God's honor because God owns everything, including Torah, and God can, okay, do whatever God wants with the Torah, including telling you don't have to honor it. But is Torah the Rav's? No, of course not. Therefore, the Rav doesn't have the ability to grant you permission to no longer honor him, her, or them, which is essentially to the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't say that well, but does that make sense?
Yeah. So
Okay.
so then Rava comes back and he says, but actually,
Right.
right,
So
yes, it is his Torah.
Yeah. So this is the moment where Rava changes his mind. And where he just said a moment before, does the Torah belong to the Rav? The implication is, of course not. And then the very next moment, Rava reconsiders this structure of Hadar Amar, basically means, and then Rava reconsidered and said the opposite. And I always wonder what happened between the word he and the word Hadar. What happened between the sentence, does the Rav own Torah? And wait a minute. Actually, the Rav does own Torah. I want to know what caused that.
Is that a structure, a structure that suggests, like, is that a common structure or a rare structure where you have this Hadar Amar, he also said, or then said?
I don't have a lot of experience in Talmud, but I've seen it a handful of times, which tells me that it's not super rare.
Because I was thinking, like, does it mean that he kind of changed his mind? Like, is this because obviously this is not written by Rava here. This is written by an editor, or put together by an editor who is got previous records or traditions or whatever about what happened. So is the editor telling us, first Rava said X and then he reconsidered and said Y? Or is the editor telling us that Rava had this kind of, it wasn't that Rava reconsidered, it was that Rava wanted to catch you in kind of a whiplash, by leading you down one path and then pulling you back to the other. And the reason why it makes a difference for me is that if it's Rava reconsidered, that's one thing. Then the question that we would ask is, I think, the question that you asked, which is, well, what made him reconsider? And the other is, if he intentionally wanted us to have a whiplash, what was he doing here? What was his trick? What was his game? And he wanted us to, not so fast. You can't, just because a father can, doesn't mean a rabbi can. But it turns out that actually a rabbi can, and so he's actually making a point in that middle category.
Yeah, my sense is that it really is recording a change of mind. The Stama, the editor, does do what you're saying often, leading you through a very highly curated back and forth debate, right, which the Stama is creating, which never really existed in history.
Right.
Leading you over and over to moments where you go, oh yeah, right. I am totally down with what, the Stama just had me agree with, only to be sort of taken up short in the next utterance where you realize, oh, I didn't think hard enough. And I think it's the Stama's meta agenda to keep crashing you. So to tell you, hey, you're not thinking deeply enough.
Right.
Let me show you, how to think better. I don't think that this structure is that. I can't be sure. Again, should be someone's PhD dissertation, but my sense is really that there was it's recording a change of mind. And it could have been as instantaneous as soon as Rava said, what, does a teacher own Torah? Oh, wait a minute. It could have been that. My daughter and I are now watching all the reruns of House,
Uh-huh.
the TV show about this
Yep.
doctor who in every show has that moment where someone will say something extraneous, unrelated. He'll be in a conversation and then he'll realize the key to the case. It could be one of those moments where Rava himself said, what do you think? A Rav owns Torah? Wait a minute. Like that.
Mhm.
I'm not sure.
Or, I mean, I feel like I'm trying to, I can't sort of place exactly these cases, but I feel like I've been reading recently in the Talmud about, or there was a case or something about, like, rabbis who taught it one way for their whole life, and then later somebody confronted them with something or whatever, and they said, I was actually wrong about that. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's I will have to do some digging. It would be really interesting if this was like early Rava and late Rava.
Mhm.
But this whole idea of who owns Torah is what's at stake here, and what you get to do. What's the difference between being acknowledged to own Torah, and the understanding that no, we don't own Torah? I think that's what's at play here.
Mm-hmm. So Rava comes in and he says, yes, it is his Torah.
Yeah.
As it is written, and he quotes from Psalms, for his delight is the Torah of the Lord, and in his Torah he meditates day and night. This is from Psalm 1.
Right. And this requires a lot of unpacking. So now Rava changes his mind and realizes, oh, wow, the Rav, the person who learns the tradition, owns that tradition. And what's never actually articulated is, what do you get to do when you own the tradition? But knowing that Rav was one of these champions of Svara, he expanded the notion of Svara from a mere logical deduction to the moral impulse, which he is quoted as citing over and over as the reason why he is radically reshaping the tradition. It seems like what's at stake is, do we or don't we get to reshape the tradition ourselves? And well, you only get to do that if you own it. And now he says, yeah, actually, we do own it. Now, his proof text is really interesting. And we should look at the text in the original, because he's using a play on the Hebrew to not only establish the fact that, yes, the Rav owns Torah, but what it is about the Rav. What is the Rav doing which effectuates that ownership, which like kicks in ownership?
Should we just, I mean, just for the, sort of sake of completeness, like just to show viewers here and listeners can look it up, on our source sheet, we have Psalm 1 here, and the Psalm 1, just in context, it says, right, happy is the man who has not followed the counsel of the wicked or taken the path of sinners or joined the company of the insolent. Rather, the teaching of the Lord is his delight, and he studies that teaching day and night. He is like a tree planted beside the streams of waters, etc. So this, again, as always, this quote has nothing to do with the context here of whose Torah is it. This is saying that a person is happy who studies the Torah, right? Who studies God's idea.
Yeah, what you're bringing out something that I think is important, which is we have to keep sort of subverting the idea of a sage and a rabbi. That's not someone qualitatively different from the everyday person. The rabbis democratized Torah and said, you no longer have to be in a hereditary relationship to leadership and authority. Any person, this is like happy is the man. This is every person. This is Amcha. This is the public, not just some elite class. And it's interesting that
Rava's using a psalm that talks about the everyday person, because I really believe that the rabbis are saying any person has the capacity to be a Rav.
I agree. I agree with that. But I mean, like the other piece that I just want to bring out of the source for this proof text, and it's the same thing that we were saying earlier. It's like they could have probably found a better text for this proof as well. Rava could have. This particular one, if you look at it, it is so obvious that it's about a completely different topic. It's saying, happiness doesn't come from doing bad things. Happiness comes from doing good things. And you should spend your time studying and studying the Torah and doing good things. And at the end of the day, the good people will win out and not the wicked people. So the point is that it's not saying here, it's not. I don't think, right? The original intent of the author here is not to say one way or the other who owns the Torah, right? And what we're about to see, in terms of, like you were saying, the wordplay is genius and wonderful, but I mean, but see it for what it is, which is wordplay, and it is using to call it a proof text, right, is almost a misnomer, because I think when people think about what a proof text is, people haven't studied a lot of Talmud, and or even many people who have studied a lot of Talmud, because they don't actually look up the source text in context. They think that what a proof text means is like, this is a text from the Torah that said the thing that the Talmud is saying. So the rabbis aren't doing anything really significant here. They're just footnoting their work to the Torah. And if you looked it up, you would see that it was exactly that. And here actually is really not. And so, now maybe in the context of what we're talking about, who owns the Torah, that point is all the more true. I mean, they're almost like demonstrating to you that we own the Torah by the virtue of the fact that we are misquoting the Torah.
Absolutely.
So, okay.
So let's go to that verse in Psalms.
In
and
Psalms?
Show how they're reading it to prove Rava's point that actually a Rav, someone who, by the way, let's remember that Rav doesn't actually mean teacher. Okay. It's one of my pet peeves that, what does rabbi mean? Oh, rabbi means teacher. Rabbi does not mean teacher. Okay. It comes from the root resh bet bet, which means much, like rove, the majority. A Rav is just someone who just knows a lot of stuff. Period. Okay. So, by virtue of knowing some stuff, if you know Aleph, teach Aleph, you get to teach a bunch of stuff. But it doesn't actually mean teacher, and it just means someone who knows a bunch of stuff. Okay. Anyway, let's take a look at the verse.
So you want to look at in Psalms? So the verse here, verse 2, the teaching of the Lord is his delight, and he studies that teaching day and night. In Hebrew, ki'im b'torat Hashem chefzo, u'v'torato yehege yomam v'layla.
Okay, so it takes Rashi to walk us through how this verse proves Rava's point. And this is how Rashi explains it. And by the way, whenever we look at Rashi, we're not really looking at Rashi to know what Rashi said, as if Rashi is like some god and we should believe Rashi. Rashi is more often than not bringing down the tradition of how the text was understood, the Talmud text, in the proofs and so on. So he's just being a little bit of cliff note. I don't know what the analogy is. He's not giving you his personal opinion that we should believe him. He's just letting you in on the traditional backstory. So, okay.
Yeah, or at least the tradition as it came down to him in the 11th century, Rashi?
Yeah.
So, it's funny because I remember asking Richard Elliott Friedman, the academic Bible scholar, is it possible that there were these traditions that kind of were really very ancient and that made it, to Rashi. And so when Rashi is interpreting the Torah, that we actually could think that maybe he actually knew of a very, very, very ancient story that had made it all the way to him. And he seemed pretty dismissive of that idea, that it was kind of like too long, too long, ago. I mean, we're talking about 1,000 years plus, that some story would have made it all, through 1,000 years orally to Rashi, and that he would actually have it as so. The point being that if something is in Rashi, it could be maybe 100 years old, but it's probably not 1,000 years. So there's some sense in what, well, when did so he's not, so it's what you're saying. I mean, he's not just giving his opinion. He's not just a smart guy who's reading this stuff and saying, well, this is how I read it. He's saying that this is how I was taught it. This is what the tradition in my community has been, but we don't really know how old that tradition is.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, so Rashi's take on where Rava says it is his Torah. Is it his Torah?
Right. So this is the Rashi on the previous statement where Rava says, and in the case of the Rav, does the Rav own the Torah? And Rashi's telling us in amazement, bitmiha, like with astonishment and shock.
Like that's how you should read it.
That's how you should read it. Rashi, this is Rashi's way of saying that's a
question mark
rhetorical question which ends with an interrobang.
Yeah, interrobang. Question mark, exclamation point.
Question mark, exclamation point. Thank you, Lizzie Heidemann, for teaching me that word. Yeah. So Rashi, because Hebrew has no syntax shift the way English does to indicate statement versus question, right? In English, we say it's his Torah. That's a statement. Or is it his Torah? That's a question. Hebrew has no shift in word order to indicate statement versus question. So it's up to Rashi here to make sure we understand this as a question, and specifically a question with an interrobang. Okay. And Rashi goes on to say that the honor to the Rav is due to the Torah that the Rav has, and therefore the Rav shouldn't be able to renounce the honor of the Torah that belongs to God. Okay, so we had established that. So here comes now the Rashi, which explains how Rava is reading out from the Psalms verse this idea that actually the Rav does own Torah, that people, at the end of the day, people who learn own the Torah they learn. People who learn the tradition own that tradition, ... and therefore can do with it what an owner can do with what an owner owns. Mess with it, change it. If you own your house, you can knock down walls, right? You can build an extra story, completely change it. You can knock down the whole thing, right?
And so in Psalms, just to look at the original verse before we go here, it's really the teaching of the Lord is his delight. Now, his here is the person who studies, right?
That's
so
right.
It's saying that the teaching, happy is the person who does not follow the wicked, rather the person who delights in the teaching of God, and he studies that teaching
of God's
of God, right? And it's really, this is not actually a great translation, and it should be something like, and he studies his teaching.
That's right, which means
day and night.
God's teaching.
So if we say God's, then we're giving it away in a way, but in the kind of King James, it should have been translated as capital HIS, right? And he studies his teaching day and night, but Rashi is going to read it differently,
right?
Or
Rashi's telling you how Rava read it. That's right. Okay.
And so he's translating his, not as capital H in his teaching, he meditates day and night.
Right, but first Rashi's unpacking who the Torah belongs to at the beginning of the verse. Ki im b'Torat Hashem chefzo. And if the Torah of God is his delight. Okay, so in the beginning, the Torah belongs to God, right? The verse says the Torah of God. Okay, so first, the Torah belongs to God. In the beginning, the Torah belonged to God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then it says, and if you engage with this Torah that belongs to God with delight, and uva Torato, and in his Torah, here's where the antecedent of his is not explicitly stated. It just says his Torah. And Rav is saying now this his is no longer referring to God, but rather to his own.
Mm-hmm.
And how does it become his own? And in his own Torah, he will engage night and day. And Rashi is saying here is Mishalam Davigirsa, once he learns it and goes over it. And this is a set expression. To be lamda vigirsa is to learn to the point of memorization and complete internalization, and to be able to orally teach it out.
Mm-hmm.
And Rashi says once he does that, clearly the verse says the Torah is his,
Mm-hmm.
because now the his, says Rava, is his, the person's.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I want to say that I love Rashi's fleshing out of the process of like what you need to do to make the Torah yours, because it so meshes with, this is not a plug, a shameless plug, but this is the way we learn at Svara.
Mm-hmm.
It's slowly and deeply to the point of absolute memorization. We call it ownership. And it's not a coincidence. And I don't know, I find it very affirming that the tradition also names that process, that kind of internalization, as the process of coming to own bracket, and therefore being sort of permissioned
Uh-huh.
to do with what an owner can do with, to mess with Torah. That's how the Torah becomes yours. And this also reminds me of what we wrote about last week.
Yeah, we wrote a piece based on our show from last week that you can find at the Svara website. But well, it's interesting. So first of all, I'll just note, and I can change this, but I translated Garsa as processes it. I think there was a different translation and I thought processes, because it's like sort of chewing it up is what I meant. Like you sort of and sort of maybe digest is a better word. It's
That's
like
interesting.
right. But I was trying to sort of get at that, like you said it very beautifully, that the translation, just to note that word was my choice, and I was trying to kind of get it to be what you said, but not in using technical terms, anyway.
But you're actually in the spirit of the Svara method, you're quite right, because the root does mean to chew up.
Yeah. Well, and I thought chew would be a little weird, so it wouldn't quite get it, so that's where I came up with processes. But anyway, that's just the source of the translation. Because, by the way, Rashi is not, I believe, not translated, or at least it's not consistently translated on Sefaria. So that was so that's why I did the translation. But it's interesting though, because like what you just said, like I'm a little bit torn on that question. Like in other words, and maybe it gets to that question of like, how much should we call Rashi the tradition with capital T, in that on the one hand, that's what he's saying, that you have to kind of learn the Torah and chew it up before you can own it. And then you say, well, that's how we do it at Svara, and that's true, and it's wonderful in its own right. And at Svara, we're only able to study some limited amount of text and of the Torah. And so does that mean that you only sort of own in the sense of being able to play with, only the text that you've really studied to that level, right? Or is there some way in which, and then the other way that I'm looking at this, but again, it also has like 2 points of view, is to say the fact of the quotation from Psalms in this way itself is indication that it's not that there is a lot of play there, and yet, right, in order to be able to misquote something so cleverly in a way, you actually have to know it very well. And so, yes, you have to know it, but don't get confused that knowing it well means being too overly what's the word, like venerating it, that knowing it doesn't mean that you somehow then give away your capacity to play and to even misquote. It's the knowing that allows you to do it even more cleverly, even more boldly, even more making it more suitable to the needs that we have today, et cetera. So I don't know, like I feel caught between this place of wanting to have the takeaway be, and therefore we should study every word, which, by the way, I'm trying to do. Like that's the one of the reasons why I'm doing the Daf Yomi, even though the daily Talmud page, even though it's not really the greatest way, is that I'm trying to know everything that there is, at least to have some familiarity with it. And on the other hand, I don't actually believe that you need to know everything in order to have that authority to play.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember that everything was very little in the time of Rava, right? There was no Talmud in the time of Rava, so he wasn't referring to the Talmud. What passed as learning was Mishnah.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a teeny tiny amount. I mean, I don't know. Anyway, if you take out all the commentaries, it's smaller than this. It's a very small amount. You could easily have memorized it, and that's what it meant to know. So number one, it wasn't so immense. And number two, I also want to be careful about kind of privileging a certain level of learning as, the criterion before which you don't get to play at all. I'm cautious about that as well. Mm-hmm. Maybe the corollary to if you know Aleph, teach Aleph is if you know Aleph, play with Aleph. And I don't know. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Like, I think it's like a little more than that. And I can't quite, like, I think it's almost like when you see once you kind of see like think about this show. I mean, I think I was thinking about just like, I think at the beginning of our hour, and I was thinking like, are we just talking about the same thing every week? Like, are we basically saying the same thing every week? And
the Talmud is talking about the same thing on every page.
Well, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Like the answer is yes and no. I mean, I think we've heard from people that they're not bored, that we're just talking about the same thing every week. And yet, there's some certain pretty small core truth here with a capital T, that we've got. Maybe we haven't quite got it to the level that we could write it, but we did write that piece last week. Like, we're getting there, right? And it's like, once you have chewed that up and process that, right, then like at that point you can come to any part of the Torah, so to speak, and by that I mean the Talmud and all the tradition, and you can have ownership over it, because you have the key. It's sort of like having the key. Once you have the key to the house, you own the house, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the Talmud is one gigantic document whose one single primary point is we have the right to do whatever we want with the tradition. And if we don't take on that responsibility, this thing is going to die. Mm-hmm. That it's a manifesto to empower a new group of people to start rolling up their sleeves.
And whatever we want, I just want to clarify. It doesn't mean that you don't mean, I know you don't, but like, oh, we just do anything we want. No, I mean, maybe we could, but the point is that like, that's not the attitude here. The attitude is that we can do what we need to do, right?
Yes, I shouldn't be so flippant. The assumption that I have underneath, we can do whatever we want, is given a certain amount of trepidation and concern and deep taking a stake and being invested in, and wanting, understanding it enough to know where it's going, to try to make it get there better, all sorts of things that have to do with an orientation of respect and honor, for sure. So this text, that for me, the text that is in the context of the question of can a teacher or a parent renounce their honor, and what does that mean about your relationship with them and their relationship with you? Again, that's the surface content of this text. I don't think this text is here because the editor really wanted to make the point that a parent can relinquish their honor, but a teacher can't, or maybe a teacher can't. That's not the point. I think the meta point here is we own Torah. And the Talmud is telling this group of people, I know we drove home to you that this came from God to Moses at Mount Sinai, and you think maybe we shouldn't touch it and that it is perfect and will always be exactly this way in its perfection because it's God. But that isn't so. I mean, they really have to undermine the myth that they sold to establish this new myth, which requires people to mess with it with care and with respect and with honor. And I think that's its ultimate message.
Yeah, so I think that's where we'll leave it today. We'll have another show between now and Shavuot, but I do want to say that, like, I think that with Shavuot coming up, it's right. What does it mean to have this marking of the revelation of the Torah at Sinai in our time? And I think what we're still sort of playing with is this idea that revelation, it's ongoing. And if we're talking about, as we've talked about and as we wrote about last week, like the Svara Torah, the Torah that's in our own bodies, in our own moral intuition, that means that we are actively participating in the revelation as opposed to remembering something that once happened. And that's why we're doing this 30-hour, you don't have to come for all 30 hours, but that's why we're really taking it seriously, that we're not just studying the Torah, but we are maybe making it. So I'm really excited to have that.
That's another great example of how we've expanded our myth in an important way, right? The myth started with one person stood at Sinai. Then it became we all, somehow our souls all stood at Sinai, whether we're genetic, biological Jews or converts, our souls all stood at Sinai. And every year we have that experience again, and every generation in the future has that experience, which imparts a sense of authority and, okay, this is mine. What am I going to do with it?
All right. So we'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Bye.
Bye.